Hello, everybody. There's one of the babies, the Mayhem twins. There's the other baby. And there is Akita, the social distancing queen. And I am the nuttiest of professors. The nutty professor. Hello, everybody. Now, I'm showing myself here, because I think that this one, I do need to kind of focus the camera on myself. And I did say, it's become so automatic, I did say hello, everybody. But this video is, and most of my videos are really just for friends and family and the few people that kind of stray accidentally onto them and go, what's going on here? And then usually stray away. I usually, shift off. But, this is for my usual limited number of friends. And now I have five. I have 5 human friends, and that's it. There were 3 human family members locally that I sort of, had connections with, but I think those connections have been severed. Wasn't a big blow up, but it's just, it's not working. So they haven't contacted me, I haven't contacted them. We used to meet at Christmas. I don't think it's happening this year. I've stopped sending them copies of podcasts. They never acknowledge them anyway. So, and my parents are in India, but that's a whole separate situation. They're there, and I don't travel there. They're not coming back here. We talk on the phone. But, and there's a lot of history there, but we kind of, we kind of dealt with a lot of things, and then they left 4 years ago, and they're being very well looked after. So that's a third of a different chapter. So really, it's right now me and my family. But my family at the moment, as my viewers know, 1, 2, and 3 kids. So that's my family. And 5 friends, which is kind of unusual for me. I've always had a lot of trouble with friends, and I usually push them away. But these 5 have stuck for almost, one has been my friend for almost 30 years. Very unusual. And then the other for maybe 2-3 years. But not a lot of actual in-person contact. Mostly text and email. So maybe that's why it's worked. And also, it's it's a different point now, and so those I've got 4 human friends, out of which 2 are dedicated cat rescuers. Now, one of the 2 is also a human rescuer, but that's okay. If you're a cat rescuer in the Nutty Professor book, you're related to rescue any species. Now, so we've got my 5 friends, 5 human friends, in my family, my 3 cats. And me. That's it. And then I do go in these excursions into the underworld, what I call the underworld. The slithery path, the trickster path, the dusty dumpster rodent weasel path, as one of the people that language, that dusty dumpster rodent weasels, slithering, that was a terminology created by someone I used to slither with a while back. So now the other thing here is this particular podcast, yes, I'm going to send it to my 5 friends, that's about it, plus, actually, I'm sending it to another person, and this is the person I really want to see this, and this person has had quite an effect on me, and I wanted to discuss this, but this has to be quite a bit of background now. So again, for the people who have been following these, the very few people, there's 200 of them, of the podcast. So of the very few people who've been following these, there's some history that you do know, and I have mentioned before, and I've done a podcast on another podcaster who is also a former psych prof and a Jungian. And I'm not technically a Jungian, but, I've been interested in Jungian theory for a while, and I've been in Jungian analysis for almost 30 years now. So, it was the framework, the so-called spiritual framework that I've kind of taken for some years, and now I'm sort of working on something else, which we're going to talk about, which is, again, covered in the podcast. So, this other podcaster, only similarities, psych prof, Jungian, which is kind of rare. There are not many actual psych profs who are, Jungian oriented these days. Most consider it too unscientific. So, psych prof, Jungian, and now podcaster with a lot of podcasts, both of us. The big difference is he's got 2.4 million viewers, followers. I've got 47 on a good day. But that's okay. I've said this before in previous podcasts. It's okay. It's okay. I got a lot less viewers. I'm not looking for viewers. I'm not looking for, subscribers. I'm not looking for subs. Okay, maybe you can use it subs. But I'm not looking for subscriptions or whatever. So that's the whole thing, his name has come up, and in almost every other way, this person, and let's name him, Jordon Peterson. I am the polar diametric opposite in every way, except for having been a psych prof, a podcaster, and influenced by Jung. But in every other thing, and even when we had addictions, when he had an addiction, it was very different from mine. It was, it was tranquilizers prescribed when his wife was ill, and, then he was sent to Russia for treatment and all of that stuff. My addiction is a very different addiction, if it is an addiction, and that's something that came up the other night, So anyway, Jordon Peterson! Oh my God, and that whole, at one time I would have considered myself left, and now I consider myself apolitical. But if I'm going to lean anyway, it's going to be to the left, not to the right, But in my podcast on Peterson, I do say left and right, the opposites, pair of opposites, are almost the same thing. So there's a reconciliation of opposites, So, I just find his take on it very distasteful. Now that's just a personal thing, and I just find it very distasteful. And I have very dear friends, two of them, the two cat rescuers. But two cat rescuers really hate Peterson. They're in the camp, and I used to say I'm kind of neutral on him, but I don't. Not my thing, I have addressed him before, and I've discussed him, and I do see him as my polar opposite. And that whole, he's got the millions of views, and the Nutty Prof has 47 viewers, and I'm like, and that's come up. That's been a theme, Now, I mentioned that because, Peterson is going to come up in this. Now, the other thing, I first heard about Peterson even. It was after I left teaching. I don't think he started his podcast until after that. And then he became famous with the controversy about politically correct language and not wanting to use pronouns and the genders and the he, she, they, them, all of that stuff. And he generated his controversy, and then he attracted his followers, and he came up with his 12 rules, one of which is, even though I don't think he's a cat person, he's a dog person, but one of which is, I'm just paraphrasing here, I haven't actually read his book, but I kind of know the rules, I would find, I would find the book a little distasteful, but I've seen him speak in the podcasts and stuff, and I've read about his rules. But if I'm not mistaken, I think one rule is, if you see a cat in the street, stop and pet it. I don't do that! I'm a cat person. Oh, sorry, sweetie. I was a bit loud there, and I think I got up. But if I see a cat in the street, I would never stop to pet it because, it could be germs. and bring it back home to my own kids. I wouldn't do that, So, and then there's one, stand up straight. I think there's one. Stand up straight. Don't be a weasel. My path is the dusty dumpster rodent weasel path, the slithering path. It's a different path, even though in a way, I think we're on our way to the same place, but using very different, methods, almost diametrically opposed, So, even though people are familiar with his, not even the 47 people really know mine because they're spread out amongst the 200 podcasts, you'd have to watch all 200 of them. No one's going to do that. No, I don't expect anyone to. So anyway, except one. My cat rescuer friend in the other province, and my analyst. Two humans who have seen each and every single podcast. Now, quite something that is. Anyway, so now, I've mentioned Peterson, going to come up in a second. And then, and like I said, my analyst mentioned him some years ago because I've been writing for a very long time, 30 years, and I've got several manuscripts, and I was thinking about trying to publish them when I stopped teaching, but I got an editor and it didn't work out, and there's just so much material, and a lot of it's very personal, and it has to be, and I wasn't sure I went to publish some of those details at this point, and then it's just such a hassle. You got to send a query letter and compare yourself to two writers, and I was like going, when I was working on my query letter, I never said it, but when I was working on my query letter, I was thinking about saying Jordon Peterson meets William S. Burroughs, but I'm much closer to Burroughs in every way. Naked Lunch, the junkie, the writer who accidentally killed his wife because he put a glass on her head, and they were both high on heroin, and he blew her brains out, accidentally. It was very high. She was very high in Mexico. I've told the story a few times, But anyway, and then he it was in Mexico, and then he escaped to Algeria, where he was into sex with, I think, boys. So anyway, that was an amazing writer. One of the very few people who I think has approached the whole sex and drugs thing non-judgmentally. There are very, very few writers who could pull that off, and he's done it. He did it. I actually saw him speak once, in his 90s at U of T, and I think he was back on the heroin then. Towards the end, he went back on the heroin, and he drank a bottle of scotch during the reading. So anyway, it's kind of William S. Burroughs meets Jordon Peterson. I mentioned Jordon Peterson only because everybody knows him. He's famous, And if you're trying to convince publishers, better to compare yourself to someone, people are familiar with than an unknown. And there are the obvious similarities, as I said, former site profs, influenced by young, podcasters. So, but in every way, I am the opposite of, and my writing is the opposite, and my podcasts are pretty much the opposite of Peterson's, except I do talk a little bit. We both talk about shadow, but I just approach it very personally and very differently, So, and some of the other Jungian concepts. So that was all. And he mentioned him in it was coming up, trying to publish, and do I want to? And he said, there are other mediums. There's this guy, there's also a former site prof at the time, Jordon Peterson. I'm like, who? And he goes, he's done a lot of podcasts, and he's become famous because he had this controversy. And then it was his podcast which led, apparently, to his, is getting published. And I'm like, maybe that's the route for the Nutty Professor today. At that point, I wasn't even completely, I had my Nutty Professor persona when I was teaching, but I've kind of resurrected it now in the podcast in a completely different angle. At that point, I hadn't even considered podcasts because I'm a bit of a Luddite, So I started thinking about it. And then my father's, just before my father's accident, synchronicitously, a former student contacted me, and we met, and he's not a video editor or anything, but he said, if you really want to do podcasts, I can help you. So there was a connection. Then my father's accident, and then after that, my struggles with the addiction, and my former student became my podcast producer. Back in 2019. So about 3 years now, 3.5 years. So, and then we started with the professionally produced and taped podcasts in the studio. And now I just do it on my phone. I learned how to do it. First, I went to the laptop, and then I went to this, and I do my own very simple editing. Though this one is not going to be edited. This one's going to be straight. I did do straight, taping for a while. And then, so we got the whole, that's how I discovered Peterson. And then I was writing something. And I was like going, how do other people, I know how I would define shadow, and I was writing about it. And I was like going, how would somebody like this podcaster guy my analyst told me about, how would he define shadow? So I looked it up, and of course he's there. And then I started watching his podcast, a few of them, get an idea. And I found them kind of distasteful, And I actually sent a copy of his podcast to my father, who's seen a few of mine. And my father's first comment was, he's very good looking. I'm like, what? No, you're saying I'm dead. But anyway, I don't think we're saying that. But anyway, so that was my introduction to Peterson, and then the more I learned, the less I liked, and then I finally addressed him. And again, he will never have heard of me. I'm just too small, too under the radar. 47 viewers to millions. I don't expect him to ever hear of me. But I did that podcast, kind of addressing him, and that was the issue. And I still believe that, politics aside, when he was sick, I do not agree with people attacking him and wishing him ill. I still don't agree with that. So no, and then after that, it turned out, my local cat rescuer friend doesn't like him, and she keeps going, he has voice and he has power and he doesn't use it for the good. Now, this other person I'm going to be talking about would question what is the good. I know that, But anyway, but I know what my cat rescuer friend means, and I kind of agree with her, and various issues came up, but I'm not gonna, it's not my thing. I'm not going to criticize them. It's just giving a little history here. So all of that Peterson stuff happened, and then with all my podcasts and addiction. My first framework was Jungian. Now, actually, before that, this is going to be longer than I thought. My first, first of all, I grew up, only child, all of that stuff. My father, non-practicing Muslim. My mother, kind of devout, but doesn't push it at others. And I think my parents do consider themselves Muslims. And at age 19 to 20, when I took my first, and I was never really, my father never took me to mosque or anything because he didn't, he was not a practicing Muslim, only on, Eid, religious holidays. But I was never really a believer, And for my father, God was more there to make sure that the cars that he purchased, his car collection, turned out well. So it was never really a thing for me. But when I took my first philosophy course, and I read Nietzsche, and I read Dostoevsky, and I read the existentialists, Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, that's when I declared myself an absolute atheist. And I would engage the religious people whenever possible. And once I think I criticized, I said something to a Muslim. This was before they got, as openly fanatic as they are now. But, I'm not going to say what I said, but he took out a knife. A long time ago. So anyway, so that was up. And then I called myself an atheist for many, many years when I was in my early 30s. And I was drinking a lot. I was already teaching. I somehow found myself, and I tried cognitive therapy a couple of times. I used to drink, and he was a nonconformist, and and I did try a couple of therapists, cognitive. One gave me homework, CBT and all that stuff, and not me. Didn't work. And then I found myself with this Jungian analyst, a woman. And the synchronicities started happening, and I'd be like, and I'd say something would come up in the session, I'd find a book on it, and then I found out that the day something very significant happened to me was the birthday of my great-grandfather, who is a Sufi mystic. And my analyst at the time said, that's not a coincidence, And then I started seeing other apparent coincidences, what Jung called synchronicities, And then I started writing. I wanted to be a writer for so many years, because when I was younger, I was an only child, I was isolated, and my knowledge came, and then when I started reading, I became voracious. I lived vicariously for many years, So at one point, I wanted to be a writer, but everything I wrote was shit, because I tried writing fiction, and it just didn't flow. So it was only after I became a prof, which I didn't really want to, and I developed my nutty professor persona when lecturing, and I was still at those days drinking and doing substances, but not the ones I'm doing now. And, and then I found this Jungian analyst, and then the synchronicity started happening. But she was the very spiritual type of Jungian analyst who would have me sit on the floor and drink tea and didn't want me to smoke cigarettes or drink caffeine, before sessions. And she would go, I see the energy of your grandmother on your shoulder. And I'm like, not my thing. And I think he told her to fuck off at some point and stormed out after writing out the check and throwing it. And then I had some issues with drinking and addiction. And then what happens? Oh, I hit a wall. I'm not going to talk about it now. It's not, I've written about all of this in detail. But I found my current analyst much more to my taste, and we worked in dreams, and he helped me through, and I went clear of booze and drugs for like 20 years. But after I left teaching, this particular combination sort of came back, the one I'm in now. I try not to talk about it openly here because there may be illegal substances and stuff involved, and then other people are involved. So I try not to talk about it here, and this whole anonymity has almost become a bit of a fetish for me. Maybe that's not the right word either. But anyway, my viewers will know that I really take lengths to provide anonymity for for the people I talk about. Now, I lost a friend over this, but now that I look back on it, that's the best thing that could have happened. Now, this person, who I'd known for some years, was very afraid that I would mention her or her husband in podcasts or in my personal writing. I haven't published no word yet. Or even in my journal entry, she was like going, I don't want you to write about us. And I'm like, you can't ask me not to write about this, about the experiences that I have and the people I talk to in my personal. What you can say to me is, if you do write about me, or you do, say something about me in podcasts, just guarantee me anonymity and so that I can't be identified, and people have said that to me. So, I've said this in a podcast too. This person had nothing to worry about because she and her husband are really quite boring. Far more interesting people over the last 3 or 4 days of slithering than those people. They're there's nothing really to talk about. So that's a bit narcissistic there. I'm so wonderful and I'm so interesting. Please don't talk about. They're very fearful people, and I'm really glad they're out of my life. So anyway, so that's what happened. And since then, I provide the anonymity on my own. Even the cats. My cat rescuer friend in the other province, I don't even mention which province, anonymity, but my cat rescuer friend in the other province, I talked about her cat. Let's call him Flame. That's not his real name. I changed the cat's name, because, I don't want the cat to be, identified, and he used to go off on binges. We don't know what he did. He was fixed. And well, maybe he found a cat in a field somewhere, but he used to go off on binges. He's been clean longer than I have. Flame hasn't been an excursion, as I call him, in a year now. I've been on quite a few excursions in that year. Quite a few in the last week. So anyway, we got, anonymity has become kind of my fetish, if you like, and I mentioned my local cat rescuer friend. I just call her my local cat rescuer friend. Now, I've been binging, and you saw that in yesterday's podcast, right after the binge. I was in the car. Now, I've been binging, and I've been into slithering, binging, underworld, and I met someone, on the binge, who has given me permission to actually use the current name that he or she is using. Now, that's the other thing. When I used to talk about my former friend, the one who was very afraid, I used to say he or she. And then the people, the slithering person, I used to go, just to make it harder to identify, another level of the anonymity, I used to go he or she. It was a she. But I was always go he or she, and whenever I mentioned someone, I used to go he or she, Now, this person said, yeah, you can call me by the name I use. You can mention the project, and you can, we can do podcasts on it, and we can go there, and now again, I don't think I really, at this point, I don't think I want to really mention the project in too much detail, but it's interesting, the whole he or she, because I can call them he or she, or I call them he, or I can call them they, them. But I will say this, and I'm pretty sure this person will allow me to say, well, gave me permission to be quite open about this, is transgender, So, and the whole thing with Jordon Peterson was, one of his first controversial things was the pronouns, and I don't think that this person that I met is very big on the pronouns because he was allowing people to call him, So I'm going to, and it was it was a synchronicitous meeting for me, because it turns out that this person is a supporter of Peterson. Actually thinks that Peterson is a little soft, kind of back down in pressure to the left, Now, I'm going to say all of this because I know that this person will allow it. And if I misconstrue a little bit, that's my artistic license. And I try not to. I try to be objective, but, yes, there might be little things slightly off. So, and this person is very specific and precise about this. And if we were talking in person, he, she, they would correct me, and would say, no, now what do you mean by this, And people like that, I get them, but it's very hard for me to talk to them, because, and then I have to backtrack and maybe this, But anyway, so here I could just rant and, if I'm a little off, okay, what are you gonna do, So anyway, it was something, Now I'm not gonna mention the specific circumstances again. It is a little. I'll write about it, and eventually, if I ever publish, we'll change names and dates and places and slightly fictionalize and have a little caveat. But for now, I'd rather skirt this. I'd rather walk this line, and I do want to share some of this because I think this is an important episode in my life, and it's very interesting. So I want to share some of this, and I think. I've got to just say, I think he's going to be okay with this, and I would have, I almost considered. Now, something we had an encounter about 4 nights ago, and, I'm not going to go into the details, but, it was a sort of a slithery encounter, let's say. We were in a different space, or at least I was, So, and there was, and I was kind of out of it in some way. He was not, So he was very, he was very coherent and articulate. And I was trying to convince him to do podcasts, even though his message is kind of opposite to mine. It doesn't matter. But very, very, very good speaker, and very, persuasive. So I was somewhat out of it, but I heard, and I was into some other stuff at the time, which I'd rather not talk about, But the place I was very open to that. Very open. I didn't feel judged. And that's been the whole thing. The whole thing about this for me is, I want to approach the alternative, the exploration of shadow, whatever that entails, whether it is, as long as it's, consensual stuff, and legal, except for, certain substances which may not be legal, but a lot of them are now, So, there's, I think if people are experimenting with this stuff, there's certain fetishes, that are, and all of this stuff. So, it's kind of into some stuff that night, and they were very not judgmental, and it was really quite something, but I was in a certain framework, and that's the approach I've been using in my podcasts. The whole, addiction, and I want to. That's so okay. So let's go back to my models. The first model I used was Jung. And there was the whole thing with the process of individuation, thinking, the 4 functions: thinking, feeling, sensing, intuiting. They form a kind of cross mandala, So we've got the thinking, and my primary one was thinking, and my inferior function feeling, which I've had a lot of trouble with, but you have to integrate, and that's the whole thing, and then, shadow, integration, confronting, integrating shadow, anima and animus, the feminine side of the male, and the whole, analysis of dreams and the ego, which in Jung, ego is entirely conscious, and it's not the center of it. Is the center of personality at first, but later on it shifts to the self. I had a discussion with Self about him, and he did say, and I was in the state where it was very hard for me to respond, but we had a discussion about Self, and he goes, the self is an abstract concept. And actually, I had an essay question on that years ago when I took personality. Is the self an abstract? That was actually I couldn't even say that at that time because I was too much into other stuff. But anyway, so, that was my thing, and that's what we've been working on in analysis for many years. The process of individuation, separation from parents was one part of it, which is very, very, very difficult for me as an only child, and particularly the unit that, I grew up in, and it's been very hard for me to separate. And we didn't really separate until my parents left for India after my father's accident and stayed. And then that's opened some other issues for me, So there was that whole thing, that was my model, It was, and there is collective unconscious, there is, synchronicities, there is a spiritual element, secular-ish spiritual element, which sort of worked for me. But now, and, and sometimes my analyst would draw diagrams of complexes and stuff like that, and it was a guide for many years, But for now, I've been kind of working on my own, frameworks, models, just that apply in certain aspects, they're very limited. But the first one that I sort of came up with when I came up with PATAP, personalized approach to addiction process. Now, my new the person I just met may actually not agree with the term even addiction, and that kind of came up too. But the whole thing with PATAP, I started off with, the first, my thing is if you don't want to turn back from the edge. Remember, my podcast were actually called Podcast from the Edge, influenced by another person who influenced me, Carrie Fisher, and her, postcards from the edge. So my podcast from the edge began with the whole thing is if you don't want to turn back, don't turn back, keep going, because there is knowledge there. There is gold. There's a reason you are doing the things that you are doing, And if you want to go, you may burn yourself out and you may not, But whatever you're doing, if you're stealing to maintain your whatever, do it. I'm not going to judge you for that, So there's that whole thing. I said that, and then I said, if you want to turn back, why are you turning back? And the number one, reason on my list was at that time I had one kid, my Agitha, and now I have three, And then, my friends were on the list, but those friends kind of are gone. So I've got different friends on the list now, but, So I got, and then my wanting to do the podcast, and my wanting to eventually publish my work because I think I have interesting stories to tell, So all of that stuff, if you don't want to turn back, don't turn back, all of that. And then I came up with, the personalization, the personification of it, it, I was using it at the time more in the Freudian sense, So it's that whole, primordial, instincts, Eros and Thanatos. Eros being life instinct, but also sexual instinct, which gets rechanneled. So we've got Eros and Thanatos, death instinct, So we've got all of that, which kind of shows up a bit in S&M type stuff. So we got the Eros and Thanatos, and we've got all of that stuff going on in the head, And I came up with a personification of it because a friend of mine at the time, it's kind of gone now. It's kind of not a friend anymore. It just faded out, But anyway, he suggested his way of dealing with addictions was to, he would personify his addiction as a dog that he'd keep chained up in the backyard, take it out for a walk, give it some exercise, bring it back, chain it up again. And I said, look, my addiction is more like a werewolf. because I turn into it, and then I run amok, there's havoc in the neighborhood, It's very hard to shape shift, to switch back to being semi-human or a feral cat or whatever I am normally. A little difficult, So, but I use the werewolf metaphor for sometimes, and I even talked about ways of killing werewolves, and and the stakes and the this and the that, the metaphors, and then what is it, wolfbane? So all of that stuff, and then so the werewolf metaphor was there for some time, and then more recently, it got hungrier. And then it turned, I've been using the dragon, which is also very symbolic. So we've got the dragon metaphor, So we've got all of that. And then I kind of added these other, animal metaphor things. So we had the person who talked about slithering, snake, very symbolic animal. And I think snake did come up the other night in the discussion with this person. And then, we got, she had mentioned the dusty dumpster rodent weasel path, I kind of like, people who slither, dusty dumpster rodent weasels, I kind of like that. So I just started talking about dusty dumpster rodent weasels, and then feral cats, and my counterparts and my friends' feral cats, and and the feral cats that I was volunteering to help when I was working at the shelter, and all of that, and then my most recent kind of edition, sort of semi-influenced by Jung, but actually more Joseph Campbell, who talks about the return of the hero archetype, and he talks about, the 12 stages, and I've talked about this in previous podcasts, so you can always go back and have a look. So I talked about the 12 stages of the hero, the heroic journey, and particularly now the return to the ordinary world, because one has tasks, and one comes back, and after the dark cave and the brush with death and the initiation into the mysteries and the masculine and the feminine and the atonement for the father and all of that stuff, and you can look at this in various stories and myths. And I talked about Odysseus, and I talked about Ulysses, and I talked about Star Wars quite a bit, so, and I've said how George Lucas was influenced, but he was a good friend of Joseph Campbell's, so we got all of that stuff going on. So I've talked about all of that, and that's my metaphor now. Return to the ordinary world from the underworld, because and so you don't want to return sometimes, because the underworld has the unimaginable delights as well as the unspeakable horrors. So both at the same time. And people often don't want to return, and there's a reason for being there. But I think I do need to return, because, if I stay there, my new, I was going to say friend, but this person that I associated with, was kind of a bit, was questioning me about how dangerous the journey is on, and I kept saying it's my age, and he goes, "You're copping out. You could say it's your diabetes, but it's not just your age, and the substances that you may or may not be doing may or may not be what people say they are. Have you had any ill effects yet?" And I go, "Not yet, except for the it's kind of hard. It's getting harder and harder to return, and I'm getting a bit exhausted for the 2-3 nights of not sleeping in the substances. So and then my other friend. So look, we get running out of time here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have to do 2 or 3 parts to this. So this is going to be for the die-hard viewers. And I really want this person to see it, because this person had an effect on me. And it's also interesting, actually, to me, it's very interesting that after I returned, and it was just such an adventure. And even though this person is a follower or an advocate of Jordon Peterson, of all people, and even that, I had to listen to, well, it was okay, because I was kind of in another space, So, that was okay. It didn't really matter. But, I'm open to stuff, So, in spite of all of that, it was really something, that whole experience. And I did feel the non-judgmental acceptance. Even though I could engage in something, that other people might think is, not societally acceptable, but, consensual adults, everybody was into stuff, and I felt accepted, and it was something else, and I kind of enjoyed the people I was with, in spite of her being a Jungian. Sorry, an advocate of who, Peterson. So, and that whole thing about the substances. I'm going to read out, and this is an email from my out of province cat rescuer, and she goes, cat rescuer friend, and she goes, thanks for your oh, that's my thing, sorry, so she's okay, wait, 1 second, I gotta pause this. Okay, I have to read it on my laptop. So, and when I went into my email to find the right one, synchronicitously, I just found an email from my analyst, and he's also very intrigued by this. If you let it go, it will let go of you. And he wants me to reflect on that. And we're going to have a session next week, a Zoom session. In my other, this person, it's also kind of found, when I talked to him on the phone, he also found that if you let it go, it will let go of you. Sort of interesting. So anyway, I'll just read out what my friend said, and then I think I'm going to have to start another podcast because this is getting a bit long. I watched your video. This is my cat rescuer friend out of province. I watched your video, but parts of it were a little hard to listen to. I honestly don't know what to say. I obviously don't understand addictions to this degree, but to say I can't go into a social setting and do their steps when what you are currently doing is also not working. I'm not sure what you think your options are. Staying clear or dying seems like a pretty drastic decision, and you may have to do something that you are not comfortable with in order to beat this. And the people who say it isn't an addiction, if you've only been doing it every 3 months, are full of absolute shit. The fact that it's so hard to stay clear and that it's a daily battle is the very definition of addiction. People saying it are not worth listening to, and just pisses me off that they're even trying to convince you otherwise. I'm not necessarily saying that that other person was saying exactly this, but there was a bit of it. Otherwise, it also justifies things as being good and bad. I guess I'm just I'm not seeing too much good in this right away. Sorry if that sounds harsh, but after attending the funeral of a 60-year-old yesterday, also a very unhealthy lifestyle, I'm not sure that I'm able to come across in any other way. And I say these things as a friend. I hope it comes across that way, and it does, So that is one of my dearest friends, and so is the other cat rescuer, and so my other 3 friends, So, and I completely see where she's coming from, and I've incorporated a bit of that into my own, perspective over the past, a few months, But after, this Peterson follower shook me up a bit, And, yes, okay, I was in a somewhat different state, but it was a state that allowed certain thoughts. And afterwards came this, if you let it go, it will let go of you, which, the Peterson person, and I don't know how to describe him really here. I usually come up with anonymous, but I don't think he'd like being called Peterson person, and he's actually, I think he's well beyond Peterson. He is in another realm, and I think it's doing him a bit of a disjustice to call him the Peterson person. But we'll come up with something eventually. So anyway, and afterwards, there was a bit of I thought he had rejected me because I did try to contact him the next day, and it was kind of approach avoidance, and I kind of wanted to go back and party more, but and kind of experience a bit more of the alternative lifestyle and the connection. But there was a misunderstanding. But there's no such thing as an accident. The misunderstanding, I think, probably it needed to happen, because otherwise I may not be there now. I'd be there, doing something else. So, it would have been very, very hard for me to return to this ordinary world if I had spent much more time in this alternate world, which has it's there for a reason. I mean, and I admire him and I admire what he's doing and I would like to support it, but I can't really be a part of it without, with giving up what I need to do here, And also that whole Peterson thing, it's just so distasteful for me, maybe, so I just can't go there, but I'm sort of glad that, and then when I talked to him on the phone the other night, and then he, and we talked a bit, and it turned out to be a misunderstanding, and he wants me to come and, sort of be a part of the whole and do some podcasts there, and I might even be tempted, but no, I'm going to a different place. So what can I say, So you know what? I'm going to post this. So here I am. There's a lot more to talk about here, So what's my next model going to be? Well, I think I've kind of exhausted the return to ordinary world. I still want to return to the ordinary world, because, and I really do think that the other lifestyle is going to be a bit exhausting for me. And my kids and my friends are very important to me. The friends I have now, and I can't take chances, and I can't, so I've really, yes, and that's the other thing. When I'm talking, let's just do this, this person, my, I don't know, Svengali, no, something, I'll come up with something for him, but this very interesting, not mentor, whatever, the catalyst for some thoughts, this person that, this person who's triggered some stuff, suggested, he thinks that my addiction is because I'm kind of lonely. I live by myself, don't have a family. I don't think he counts the cats as my family, but he thinks that getting the cats is a good idea because, it's a responsibility, but, but he doesn't anthropomorphize his animals. I mean, the dogs are outside, they're just dogs, So, but he doesn't anthropomorphize, animals the way that I do and my closest friends do. So, he thinks I'm kind of lonely, and I've chosen this to a certain degree, not entirely, but I've chosen the solitude, up to a point. And I do have, and that's why I started with talking about the friends. I do have these very close, even though I don't see them much, some of the one out of province I haven't seen in 20 years in person, So even though I have these close friends, I don't really, I'm not around people in person a lot, but it kind of suits me. However, what he was offering, that was a community, it was a collective, and it was an alternative collective, and it was, something that a lot of people might not, agree with, but I think alternative lifestyles should be explored, and it was an idea that kind of intrigues me, and it is, there is pleasure and pain, and there's also the other stuff, and he's quite a charismatic person, and there's some safeguards, and and I think he's doing something really positive, in a certain sense. So I would have liked to be a part of that, but on the other hand, it's not collectives of any kind, even the underworld kind, are not my thing, And yes, there's a community there, but I don't fit in really anywhere. And now this one is a little underground, a little extreme, and they're very accepting of me, which I'm grateful for. And I would be like, but if I went there, it would be very, very, very hard to come back. And I've got my kids, I got my friends, and if I was to become more of a part of that lifestyle, it would be very hard for me to keep up the podcast. They would go in that direction, in his direction, not in mine, and it would be very hard for me to keep writing and to try to publish. So that whole Peterson thing just won't work for me, So I'm kind of glad the misunderstanding happened. And then afterwards, I'm sorry, but I blocked him, because I can't go there, So now I'm going to, but meeting you was, I really hope you're watching this, because it's been a stimulus, And now I'm going to work on, if you let go of it, it will let go of you. And at this very, just a couple of minutes ago, my analyst said, let's work on this in the next session. So let's see where this takes me. So, but still, I'm not going to count the days, but I think it's better for now. Because when I go big or I go home, as they say. I go all out. So when I do, physical stuff and, mind-altering stuff, I don't do tiny little moderate amounts. The naughty professor doesn't do things in moderation. I think it was William Blake who said, what is it? The road to excess leads to the palace of wisdom. Well, I've certainly been into the roads of excess. Now I don't sure if the wisdom's here yet. So anyway, you know what? I might divide this into two and do it as a two-parter. Anyway, bye for now. Nutty Professor, signing out. And I'm not going to do any further editing. This is as is, raw. And then we'll see what we can add to this later. So I'm still around, and I'm finding a different path. I mean, it's always a path. I've also mentioned Krishnamurti, Jiddu Krishnamurti, and this whole spiritual thing in terms of one has to find one's own path. One enters the woods. He said, I think truth is a trackless land. So you got to make your own paths. I've also been thinking about the rabbit hole, because I was kind of offered a rabbit hole the other day, and it was kind of appealing to just go down it. But no, I can't get Lewis Carroll. I mean, that was a Christian, allegory too, and the whole, any kind of organized religious thing is just not my thing. He's also this person also very much a Buddhist. So I have, in a way, I don't think practicing, but I did look at the Four Noble Paths, the Four Noble Truths, and the Eightfold Paths some years ago. And in one of my podcasts, much earlier podcast, I did tell the Buddha to fuck off. That was a whole time ago. So anyway, so there we are. All kinds of stuff happening here. So I've been on my own path, but it has to be my own path, and that's why to my friend, and I really appreciate what she said, but I'm trying to tell her that rehab is not my path, that whole thing of, I said this a long time ago, the whole 12 steps. I mean, if the and this other person I brought it up on the phone the other day, and then he went in a certain direction, and he's very analytical. And when I'm around people who are very analytical like that, I kind of, even when I'm sober, I kind of shut down, or I kind of, well, I know what they're saying, but it's really hard to come up with a response, So, but I know what he was saying, So that whole thing with, a long time ago, somebody at the rehab, when I went to one 12-step meeting, said, if you don't stop, your addiction, you're going to die. And the person I was talking to on the phone, this new person was like, really tore that whole thing apart, and my thing in the podcast was, I took it in a slightly different angle, and it was like, I talked about J.K. Huysmans and the two choices, the barrel of, this is always more than two, but the barrel of the gun or the foot of the cross, metaphorically, and my choice would always have been barrel of the gun, So, but we're not there, and we're not at the foot of the cross either, I am, better or worse, good or bad, I am going to find my own path, the nutty professor path, the feral cat path, the dusty dumpster rodent weasel path, and the next kind of signpost here is, if you let go of it, it will let go of you. And as my analyst said, and as the other person said, what is it? Next podcast. Bye for now. The nutty professor. I'm going to keep going. Look, we're going to do this, one way or the other. Bye for now. We're doing it in our own way. We're not doing it rehab, that the nutty professor doesn't do rehab. Conformist, conformist society. It sounded like a Petersonian, whatever. No. Bye for now. See you next podcast. Bye from the kids and myself.